This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. On this episode, we welcome activist, speaker, best-selling author, and public theologian BRIAN MCLAREN. We discuss his new book, Faith After Doubt, Dismantling White Supremacy, and the influence of the late Rachel Held Evans.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And today we're happy to bring you a bonus edition of the Vicar's Crossing. Because one this week wasn't enough. Nope. We're bringing you the bonus episode today. And if you're watching this, you're probably watching it Sunday or Monday or Tuesday.
Yep. And a big bonus it is too, right?
Yes, it is. Because today we have been so hoping that we would get a chance to invite this gentleman into the podcast, and we were finally able to connect with him and do this today. BRIAN MCLAREN.
That's big.
Folks. BRIAN MCLAREN on the podcast today. So he'll be joining us in a few minutes. He's got a new book out, which is called Faith After Doubt, Why Your Beliefs Stopped Working and What to Do About It. So we're going to talk about that book and some of his other things. And he's been a real influence on both Kevin and I know a lot of people over the years. So really looking forward to chatting with BRIAN today.
Amazing guy. So one of the things we like to do every episode now is acknowledge the lands on which we record this podcast. So the Vicar's Crossing acknowledges that our podcast is recorded on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenawapak, and Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse and indigenous peoples, our neighbors who are Métis, Inuit, First Nations, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of this land and vital contributors to our society. And we pray, along with others, for that day when we do reach full reconciliation and continue to work towards finding ways to take ownership of our own part in how we have failed in relations with our First Nations brothers and sisters.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. It's important. And for those of you who may be tuning in for the first time, maybe the BRIAN MCLAREN name grabbed you a little bit more than Kevin, Rob, and Iain, which we could completely understand. If this is the first time you're joining us, we want to introduce ourselves too. My name is Rob Henderson, and I'm one of the vicars on the crossing, and I'm the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Church in London, Ontario.
It's important if you're listening for the first time to know who we are. Mm-hmm. I personally, I'm Kevin George, and I'm vicar number 2, and I hang out at a church called St. Aidan's in Northwest London with some really great people. One of those great people that's in my community is a guy on the screen right here.
My name is Iain. I am a singer-songwriter and the producer and the mind behind the Vicar's Crossing right here.
That's right. He is the myth behind the legend.
That's right.
The legend behind the myth.
Sure.
You would be listening to this on a Radio Shack battery operated
that's right.
piece of junk if it wasn't for Iain, because
wind up.
That's about all we could do. That's about all we could do if it wasn't for Iain.
Yeah. A wind up radio too, Robbie. Like not a battery operated one. We'll wind up.
No, wind up.
Yeah.
We also have a few sponsors on the podcast that we are very appreciative of, and we want to say hello to them. First to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And our thanks to Dave Mullen and the staff at A. Miller George for their great support.
Thank you, Dave. Say hello to Debbie for us, will you? And we want to acknowledge Hyde Park Care Pharmacy up on Hyde Park Road. It is locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. Step away from the big box operations and move towards one of your local pharmacies. Carol Basada is a great person. You won't be disappointed. It's like having a family pharmacist at your disposal. So check out Hyde Park Care Pharmacy.
And last but certainly not least, we want to say a huge thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Wow.
Trisha Lister hooked us up with that one, and we want to say
she's
huge thank you
amazing.
to them.
She's amazing.
She's great.
Absolutely
She's
incredible.
great.
Yeah.
Very good. All right, guys. Well, before we bring Brian in, we want to give him as much time as possible because we've got lots to talk about. We're going to dive right into our latest segment and kind of the new game show we have here on the Vickers Crossing, which we like to call, Iain.
It's not a lie if you believe it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So Rob, again, to the newly initiated, what is this?
Well, this is an opportunity for one of us to tell a story.
Okay.
With the understanding that we could be lying or we could be telling the truth. But either way, if it's truth, obviously. But if it's a lie and we believe it, well, that's the truth too. According to our good friend George. Yeah.
George Costanza.
Because it's not a lie if you believe it.
If you believe it.
So
I was watching him last night. I watched him last night on one of the reruns. He had swishy pants.
Swishy pants, yeah. I remember that one.
A suit that he hid away in the store, so the other short, pudgy guy couldn't get it.
So I think it's my turn, right?
This is your turn to tell us something that is either a lie or not a lie if you believe it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's have it. Let's have it. What do you got? What do you got?
I was wondering about this because I wasn't too sure if Iain would know this person, but just trust that this person, in the time frame that this happened, was incredibly famous.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the story I have is that I stepped on Freddie Couples' foot.
Fred Couples is a golfer, Iain, if you don't know who Fred Couples is.
Yeah. Freddie used to be like the #1 player in the world. And
yeah.
So this was back, I'll give you a little hint. It's back in the kind of early to mid 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And he was, he's playing like a senior tour now, but back in the day, I stepped on Fred's foot.
Okay.
Like on the golf field, or like was it in a supermarket?
He's not saying where, but it sounded like
okay.
We're not getting that out of him, are we?
Gotcha.
Stepped on his foot.
I think the only thing he's telling us, he says he stepped on his foot. So I'm going to go with this is true because to my memory, there was a seniors event at Essex Golf Course down in LaSalle or Amherstburg, at LaSalle, right? LaSalle. And I don't know, but I feel like I remember you and Brett and the family having gone to that event. So I think you would have been in proximity. So I'm going to go with it's not a lie, even if you don't believe it.
That's right. Okay, Iain, what do you think? I stepped on Fred's foot. #1 golfer in the world.
I don't see why not. I see like it's one of those things that it's
why not step on Freddie's foot?
Yeah, why not? But also you like Kevin said, you're kind of in that proximity, right? Like you have golfed before and like have like done a lot of those golfy things. I don't know how to golf, so I'm gonna say it's true. I believe it. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Well, guys, it's true.
Yeah.
I did step on Fred Couples' foot. It was very embarrassing. And I shrunk very quickly, opened a hole in the ground.
How did you step on his foot?
It wasn't the late mid 90s when I was working at the radio station. We got press passes to go up to Glen Abbey in Toronto to see the Canadian Open one in September.
Okay.
So me and another guy from the station went up and we got down in the press tent downstairs and they were walking people up to the kind of backdrop where they do interviews. And I wasn't paying attention. We were sitting down at one of those little booths and tables, and there were people walking by. I was busy, and I stood up and turned around, and I stepped on this guy's foot, and I heard, oh, and I looked, and oh my God, it's Fred Couples. And they were rushing him down the alley, kind of between all the desks to get him to the thing, and I kind of bumped into him. I stepped on his foot.
How did he play after that, Rob?
And I went, oh, whoops.
How did he play after that, Rob?
It was after the round.
It was done.
They were bringing him in for an interview.
Okay,
right?
so it was last day, because if he had to play the next day, there's a Seinfeld episode in there.
Oh, that's right. There is. Yeah. No, I think it was like the first day, like the Thursday
Oh,
or
okay.
something.
So you could have
Yeah,
affected
of
his
the
whole
tournament.
weekend.
So I did get really close to Fred Couples, but I unfortunately stepped on his foot.
So it wasn't at the seniors event down in Essex.
No,
that,
it wasn't
no,
wasn't
no.
there,
Yeah,
but
okay.
you know, he's probably
All
there.
right.
Yeah, probably
All
saw
right.
him in a couple of places there. So anyway,
Well, that's a good one, Robbie. But
yeah.
we'll look forward to hearing from Iain next week and what sort of stuff he's been up to and whether he tells
Oh, yeah.
lies or the truth. Listen, it's Black History Month. This is our last episode for Black History Month. We've highlighted some incredible people throughout the month. And listen to the music, man. I hear something in the background. Robbie, it's you with Black History Month this week, and I feel like you're giving us a little. What do you got?
You recognize any of that? I want to
Play
do
it-
this for my buddy Iain.
Play a little
Okay,
more.
listen. So Iain, when I years ago, my grandma, back in the day before CDs and streaming and
Yes.
all that, we used to have this old stereo system. Remember that, Kevin? You flip
Yes.
the top up,
Top
all
up,
the
and you had the
records would
radio.
be-
That's
and
right.
she always
8-track
had
records, AM,
records and
FM
everything
radio.
like- and she always played jazz music, and she
Love
had
jazz.
a whole bunch of. And I was thinking of this guy the other day, bunch of Oscar
Oscar Peterson, right?
Oscar
Ooh.
Peterson, yeah.
Fantastic.
Oscar Peterson, born in Montreal, great
Incredible.
Canadian jazz pianist and composer. We lost him in 2007, but
Yeah.
boy, tons of Grammys, Junos in the Juno Hall of Fame, received the Order of Canada, Oscar Peterson Hall in Toronto.
Right. Yes.
Right. There's a statue
course.
of him in Ottawa that the Queen
Yes.
Elizabeth unveiled some years ago. So
Yeah.
a real icon in Canadian music, Canadian Oscar Peterson. And I was thinking of those days being in the house and hearing that stereo going, right,
Yeah.
with all the music. So I was,
There we go, man. I like this. Let's just listen.
Killing it.
word was when he was 9 years old, he would practice 4 to 6, 7 hours a day. He'd just sit at
Wow.
the piano like as a kid and just play.
Well, a
And
Canadian
anyway,
legend,
Oscar
an
Peterson,
icon.
yeah. Wanted to get some music in there too. So Oscar Peterson, that one's for you, Iain. Black History Month.
Amazing.
Remember
All
him.
right, man. That's a good one, Robbie.
Cool.
Thanks, man.
Okay. Well, I think if I see here, Brian's knocking on the door. So
Yeah, well, let's let
Good.
Brian in.
Mhm.
let's do that. Let's do
All
that.
right.
We'll bring him in with some music.
Uh,
And here he is. Brian McLaren has joined us on the Vickers Crossing podcast. And Brian from sunny, warm Florida, we're sure. How are you today? And thank you so much for being here.
It's always good to be with Vickers.
All right.
yeah.
Good
Hey,
stuff.
here's a question. Are you an Oscar Peterson fan?
I don't think so.
Okay, because you just came on to the beautiful music of Oscar Peterson. Oscar Peterson, we're doing Black History Month. We'll come to that with you near the end of the podcast. But each week at the beginning of our podcast, we're highlighting somebody else in Canada. And Rob just highlighted jazz great Oscar Peterson, who's a big
Oh,
deal here
great.
in Canada.
Well,
And
I'll have to look into him. 'Cause I
listen,
love
and
jazz.
you just
Oh,
came
you love
on.
it.
You just came on to the beautiful music of Oscar Peterson.
Oh, that's great.
Well, I hope you're well in Florida. We know everything's been going on throughout the world and down there especially. We hope you and your family are well and keeping okay. And and we're thrilled that you could spend some time with us, Brian. So
Well, thanks.
big
Glad to
welcome
be here.
from all of us
And
here.
Thank you. And we're doing well. Thanks be to God. But boy, we're all aware of how many are grieving and suffering. And
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Hey, let's kick things off with the hot off the press's brand new book, which I was so looking forward to getting my teeth into and pre-ordered, and it arrived, and here it is.
There it is.
All right,
Faith After
and
Doubt.
There it is. Faith After Doubt is Brian's new book. So we want to get right into that, why your beliefs stopped working and what to do about it. And I won't open it up, but all of Brian's books just have so much underlining and highlighting, and they end up to be, sometimes I don't know, what I did to them, but very transformative and helpful and in so many different ways. So I'm thrilled to be able to have you on to talk about this. So let's get right into that. I do want to point out to our listeners though that because I mentioned this to a friend of mine that I was reading this book, and they asked, well, good, I could use some help with getting some answers and getting rid of some of that doubt that I struggle with. That this book actually is not about like a how-to book in the sense that it's not how to fix your doubt so you can walk around as this confident person with all your beliefs and have all the answers for anyone. This is a book that I think and I experience that will ask you to be vulnerable, that'll ask you to be honest about your journey and about doubt, which I found really transformative in this. So, Brian, I wanted to ask you just a couple of questions about two aspects of the book. The first is kind of on an individual level, and the second is more of an institutional level question. So, first, on an individual level, you explore doubt in our lives as people of faith, and you take us through some of the stages of faith that so many people go through on their personal journeys, and you spend a good portion of the first part of the book on that. Oftentimes, doubt rears its ugly head wherever we are on the road and can leave us questioning and struggling with who we are and where we belong. So there's kind of a personal aspect of identifying and naming where we are as individuals. Can you talk about why you think it's so important for us to kind of understand and identify the stages of faith that you talk about in the book, and how these doubts can actually be a doorway as we go through this, a doorway to maybe
Yes.
something new and transformative?
Well, what a good question, Rob. The first thing that comes to my mind is this, is an analogy. My wife and I have 4 adult children, but I remember when my wife was pregnant with our first child, we went to these childbirth classes, and the nurse told us what to expect in the first trimester of pregnancy and the second trimester, third trimester. And that way, when a whole lot of wild things happened, we weren't taken by surprise. It's obviously much harder for my wife than for me, but it's hard enough to go through all those changes to your body, even harder if you're not expecting them and you don't know what they are and why they're happening. And then, of course, when it comes to delivery, you find out about the different stages of delivery. And there's this very scary time called transition that's terrifying. But when you know that it's coming, at least you aren't surprised. And I think that's how it is with faith. And there are a lot of ways that faith is like giving birth, but to know that these things, that doubt is normal, and to know to expect it, and to know why it's happening and what it produces. And I think that's one reason it's so important. And then the other is maybe on the flip side of this, that if we have doubts and it's not socially acceptable in our churches to talk about them, then we either feel that we're worse than everybody else, we're the only person with these problems, or we start pretending. And, I don't think doubts are harmful to our faith. I think they're a necessary companion to faith, but I do think pretending is not really good for a person of faith. So those are reasons why I think it's important on this personal level to talk and have ways of talking about doubt.
Right. And it's so important, like you said, to name that and to say that I got questions and doubts and I'm not sure. And I remember a conversation I had with someone talking about coming to church or being part of the community or something. And his first thought was, well, I can't take part in that. I don't believe all that stuff. And I said, well, then we're exactly where you need to be, because we're all struggling with it too, brother. So important. On our podcast, we talk a lot about how the church is often focused on itself. Surprise, surprise. Sometimes as opposed to focusing on how the disciples that are in the church are being transformed for the benefit of the world outside the church. And Kevin and I, we often scratch our heads and talk about this when every year we're asked as priests in our diocese to submit statistics for the past year that say, so many people were sitting in the pews on Lent 2. And when we're never asked about, though, how those people are transformed while they were sitting in the pews so they can be out in the world and taking part in that. So it's self-interest in the church is very much still alive. But as you say, doubt can also be a doorway. And I wanted to just read a little quote from your new book. You write that doubt is so necessary these days. Doubt that refuses to settle for religion as is, doubt that deconstructs the systems of beliefs, and that upholds authoritarian structures. And I read that and I underlined that because that's a real powerful message about recognizing that there's a huge group of folks out there whose doubts and questions have led them to a place where they're like seeking communities that have kind of moved beyond that self-interest that often we see in the institutional church. And you're right that institutions that systematically help people to achieve the most advanced forms of moral development are learning through practice, and those are needed and are being searched for.
Yeah.
So can you share a little bit more with us about this vision of faith communities being places of moral and human development, as opposed to places where people come to kind of receive the right beliefs and have everything
Yeah.
dispersed to them?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we shouldn't be surprised that there's confusion around that. I mean, in one sense, that's what institutionalism is. Every
Yeah.
institution presents itself as solving a problem. And in some ways, its existence is dependent on that problem continuing to exist.
Yeah, that's
So,
right.
Exactly.
It's a self-serving outfit, isn't it?
That's right. And then very often what happens in institutions is they actually forget what that problem was, or they do solve the problem and they need to come up with some other reason, and basically their own existence becomes their reason for existing. So that's just common. That's common in government and business and education and religion too. But there's another sense that's especially tragic in the Christian faith, when Jesus' whole life is about others, giving himself for others. And he sends his disciples into the world to follow his example of being agents of love in this world. And so when something that bears the name or the brand of Jesus it becomes self-interested, we're really in trouble. And
Yeah.
and so often and I think we took a turn in Christian history that really reinforced that. You know, Jesus was about the kingdom of God coming to earth. In other words, God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven.
Mhm.
And then what happened in Christianity is we became about how to get people into heaven after they die.
Right.
And I mean, that is so deeply embedded in our liturgies and in so many of our theological systems. So it's not surprising we have this problem. And I'm thrilled that guys like you are talking about seeing the church as this movement to equip people to be agents of love and joy and peace and so on in the world, so that we actually become like salt and light in the world, contributing to the world becoming more beautiful and more just and more peaceful and so on. And this to me is, if we want to think about a reformation, we want to think about a major turning point in Christian history, I think it would be exactly around this. Around this idea that God does not want the church to be a warehouse that brings souls together until they're shipped to their final destination.
Right.
But that this really is a movement of social and global transformation. And we get together each week to inspire people and equip them in that process. Now, one other thing I'll say is that this issue of faith and doubt plays into this, because when the church defines itself as kind of a belief propagation and policing organization, then of course that's what it does. But if we were to let go of that reason for existence, we're not here just to make people believe certain things and then police those beliefs. We're actually here to help people become the most loving and just and peaceful versions of themselves that they can be, with God's help. Then that just changes everything.
Well, I think that's right on. I mean, I just think about, we did a pub study of the Great Spiritual Migration, and I think that one of the things that I saw out of the 25 or so that were coming to that group was an excitement about a willingness to talk about the things that we had so many doubts about.
Yes.
And to think of the notion of moving from schools of or institutions of belief to schools of love, to places where we actually model. And, one of your books here, We Make the Road by Walking. Yesterday with Al Roxburgh on here, we talked about, he writes about it in his new book as well. He uses that turn of phrase from that poem, We Make the Road by Walking.
Yes.
And one of the things he talked about, and I just thought about as I listened to you answer that question, Rob's, is it's so right that so many people have bought into the notion that we're on the road to get to some final destination where everything is going to be, well and good, and we can eat all the Kentucky Fried Chicken we want, never gain a calorie, and all that sort of crazy shit and all that stuff. But it's like, where my diabetes is not a worry, and I can eat jujubes till they pop out my eyeballs. But it's but it's such a shallow reality, because stuff comes down to pipe, life comes down to pipe, right?
Yeah.
And when it does, it's so disillusioning. And so that need to put one foot in front of the other once at a time, and to make the road as we walk, and to actually welcome the spirit of the divine into the middle of that, which makes this book here, this We Make the Road by Walking, such a great book. Pick that one up too, folks. But it really is about modeling and reorienting and activating a way of discipling in the world today, which is not about some old model of getting somewhere, but about being somewhere and actually living a kingdom right now. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, beautifully said. In fact, if we were to take that word, being here, and then becoming, this idea that we're never going to be done, and that what really makes life exciting is not crossing a line and then just sitting there. What makes life exciting is being on that journey, and that journey of becoming and development through all of our lives. And, we live long enough when we realize you never really grow up.
Right.
You can stagnate. That you definitely can stagnate. But if you don't stagnate, you find yourself continuing to grow. And not only that, but as you said, life throws some stuff at you that can set you back. You can have a bad year or a bad decade where you actually lose ground. You become a meaner person, an angrier person, a more selfish person. So we're all in that dynamism. And to me, the healthiest kind of faith is something that puts us in a quest to keep growing through all the seasons of our lives.
I've been reflecting a bit on, in this pandemic time, in this lockdown time, where we've not been in our church buildings over the last year for the most part, that the institution has got to a point, and we weren't obviously expecting this, but to a point where the ability to disperse what we, especially priests, have been trained to disperse, has been taken from us. Like that, we couldn't do it. Right. And so we were scrambling, trying to find ways, like recording our services and making phone chains and all that, which is all well and good. But when that one thing that we base everything around that we do is gone. I've been reflecting on how's that changed us. And I haven't come to the final answer yet, but boy, that was a real eye opener for me when I was thinking about that
Rob,
it's got to change.
It warms my heart to think of you and other priests and clergy thinking about this. If I could make a plea to everybody, it would be between now and whenever it is that we can, that lockdowns end and quarantines end and we can meet in person again. My plea would be that every vestry, every leadership group gets together and has this conversation. How can we be sure not to return to the old normal? What would we like our new normal to be? One of the amazing things that church has learned is we can be way more flexible than we realize.
Oh yeah, incredible.
And so let's not now just lose all of that and go back to the old normal. But let's say, and one of those questions is exactly the question you raise. What's our purpose? I heard someone refer to a local Catholic church as a mass factory because they have like 6 services every Sunday and they get people in and get them out. And you think, okay, well, that's, I suppose, okay. Restaurants in some ways are food factories. They get people in, feed them, send them out. But when you think, shouldn't churches have this goal? You used the word, Kevin, a little while ago, of discipleship. Shouldn't we have this goal of actually helping people become Christ-like human beings? And then if you to think, that's our primary job. And whether gathering in person or having something online or anything else that we do, this podcast, to contribute to helping people actually become Christ-like people. Man, that just changes your job description.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And actually gets me excited about doing it. I don't know about you, Rob, but
very much so, because
as a job description I could take.
Right, because one of the things, again, reflecting on that idea of being able to disperse, being taken away, it's forced us and me to say, well, God's still doing God's stuff out there. Just because I couldn't give it through the many ways that we do it, it doesn't mean it's not happening. I got to be more focused on what was going on there in the last year and meet God there, right? And these are great conversations to have, definitely.
Well, one of the people that really, I think, that we lost and sadly was great in this dialogue in terms of a conversation around discipleship and seeking out God and doubt and so on was Rachel Held Evans. And I
Yes.
know Ian's got a question about Rachel, and
Yeah.
he may before that have a question about those instruments on the wall, because it looks like the two of you have a shared interest. But
Well, I was just thinking, like, before I wanted to ask my question, I really wanted to know about the instruments that are hanging up on his
tell
wall.
us
'Cause
about these instruments.
you joined the Zoom call with these wonderful, like, beautiful looking instruments, and I was like, I really got to know about these.
Obviously, I've got a violin back here. I'm not a great violin player, but I played a bit when I was a kid, and I still love the violin. A classical guitar, a baritone guitar, and a mandolin. And I
That's-
love music.
That's amazing. Oh man.
Anyway, on to Rachel.
Anyway,
I just knew
yeah.
that he was going to want to know about
Well,
these instruments.
absolutely. I just
And,
I was just itching to find out.
Well, let me, because he won't plug it. So let me plug it
Oh.
to the listeners and to Brian. It's called Somebody's Journal on iTunes and Spotify and all that. Ian's recently released an EP. He's a beautiful
Hey.
songwriter, an incredible songwriter. Give it a listen, Brian. It's called Somebody's Journal.
We'll send it to you after this.
I'm a songwriter too, Ian, and I love finding songwriters. So glad to meet you.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Well, let's talk about Rachel Held Evans really quickly, because that's more on the crux of this podcast. Like so many, my mother is fond of Rachel Held Evans' writing, and she was saddened to hear when she passed on. You read about your friendship with Rachel Held Evans and how her vulnerability was a gift that drew you closer to her. You quoted one of her blog posts, and I was wondering if you could read it for us, and then I'll have a question after you finish.
Sure. Well, these are such poignant words from Rachel Held Evans. She wrote, "I don't always tell you about the mornings I wake up and feel the absence of God as though it were a presence, thick and certain, remembered all over again the way you remember in the morning that someone you love has died. I don't always tell you about how sometimes I'm not sure I want to bring kids into a world like this one, a world so full of suffering. What do you do when the religion that is supposed to give you comfort and direction is the cause of your pain and confusion? What do you do when religious people respond to your questions by calling you names, by mocking you, by casting you out? I don't always tell you about the depth of my doubt. I don't always tell you about how the cynicism settles in like a diaphanous fog, or about how sometimes just the thought of reading one more Christian book I only half believe exhausts and bores me. Sometimes it frightens me how effortlessly I can move from belief to unbelief as one would move from room to room. I don't always tell you because when a reader says, I love it when you write something vulnerable, I wonder if she really means it. If she really wants to know that the demon whose voice she thinks she's quieted in her own heart is screaming like hell in mine. And that the scariest thing about being vulnerable, about exposing myself to the world without a religion or a platform or a brand for protection, is that I might lose them for good, or perhaps learn that I can breathe without them. And that's exactly the sort of, and that's not exactly the sort of born again experience that publishers pay for.
And in many ways, Rachel embodied what you write about in your book. She touched so many people by acknowledging her own vulnerability and doubt. Is her life a testimony to what life after doubt would look like?
Yeah, I think so, especially because one of the things that Rachel made so clear, and that I try to make clear in this book, is that when I say faith after doubt, I don't mean that you have faith and then you have doubt and then you go back to having faith. What I'm saying is a little bit more like marriage after children. Of course, some marriages end after children, but the idea is that you're married without children, and then children come on the scene, and then your marriage goes on with children.
Right.
And so doubt becomes a companion. And Rachel's honesty was so powerful in that. And also the fact that her first reaction to people who articulated doubt to her was not to try to fix them or answer them, but to have empathy with them. And I just think that's so important. I often think that the worst thing that could happen is that people create arguments that prove the existence of God, because the only way that I think the existence of God should be proven is through the love of human beings.
Amen.
That God is incarnated through the love of human beings. And in a funny way, giving a person an answer to their question without loving them almost defeats the whole purpose, I think. So
yeah.
And
You miss her.
Rachel did that so well.
You miss her, no doubt.
You know, Rachel, was just a lovely, lovable, loving human being, and she meant so much to so many people.
Yeah.
I shared some of that at the end of this book, but
Yeah.
there were other things. That book, We Make the Road by Walking, that you
Yeah.
mentioned.
Yeah.
When I was working on an early draft of that, I sent it to her and got her feedback on it. And so we just a lot of things to miss when a good person is gone.
Yeah. Well, bears sending out our love to her family, who
right.
continue to adjust their lives, and to the many people who listen to this podcast and many others whose lives have been formed because of the prophetic words that Rachel had.
Yeah.
I want to talk a bit about faith, belief, and revolutionary love, this chapter in your book, which I really like.
Yes.
You write, I have all kinds of mixed feelings about slogans. They often oversimplify and therefore mislead, but they're pithy and memorable and therefore have some value. So acknowledging my mixed feelings, you write, I'd like to offer this pair of slogans to summarize the heart of our messages so far. I'll give you royalties, but I'm going to get bumper stickers made. Okay. So, and this is what they would say. They say, faith before doubt is about correct beliefs. Faith after doubt is about revolutionary love. In other words, the journey of faith, you write, through simplicity and complexity involves learning and perfecting beliefs. The journey of doubt through perplexity involves questioning not only specific beliefs, but the whole belief system approach to faith. Then the journey into harmony is a journey beyond beliefs and into revolutionary love. Could you talk to us about this revolutionary love?
Sure. Well, maybe one way to do it is to say, we have this library of books we call the Bible. And there's the first section that's called law. And that corresponds very well to what I call stage one, where we're interested in right and wrong, do this, don't do that, thou shalt not, that kind of thing. And that's important. Children need to learn, don't run out into the street. They need to learn, don't eat anything you find laying on the ground, because their health depends on it. They need the do's and don'ts. But then you move into complexity. And what's interesting in the Bible is we have a book like the book of Proverbs that goes beyond the law and talks about wisdom and this need to develop wisdom and understanding and seek for knowledge. And so that it corresponds to the second stage I call complexity. But then we have books like the book of Ecclesiastes that say, you know what, this whole thing looks like a big game and it doesn't work out as neatly as they said in those first two parts of the Bible. Or you come to the prophets, where the prophets actually say, all of this talk about law and sacrifice, it doesn't mean anything if you don't take care of the poor and the widow. And so they come with this deep critique of simplicity and complexity, and they start pointing to something far deeper. And the prophets point to this idea. For example, the prophet Hosea says, God doesn't care about your sacrifice. What God wants is compassion. Micah says something very similar. And Jesus comes on the scene, and his whole message is summed up in love. Paul expands upon it, and in some ways even deepens it. He says the only thing that matters is faith expressing itself in love. And so this idea that everything, that love isn't just one item in a list of important things, but it's actually the goal and the whole path that we walk. And what makes it revolutionary, especially in the teaching of Jesus, is that everybody loves. Everybody loves themselves. Everybody loves people who like them and are nice to them. I'm sure you all have paid attention to our politics, and our previous president, he loved people.
Do you have something going on down there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So our previous president loved people who did exactly what he said and said
Who
what he
loved
told
him,
them to
yeah.
say. But then the trick comes, do we love not just the people who like us and are like us, but the people who are different from us and the people we don't understand? And then do we even love our opponents and those who attack us and misunderstand us? And so this revolutionary love always goes a step beyond. And I think it even goes beyond human beings to say we love our fellow living creatures, the plants and animals. And it even goes beyond them. Well, we actually love the soil and the air and the water because we realize we're all part of it. It's part of us. And that is the revolutionary love that it seems to me always calls us higher. You can
Right.
you can learn the law and consider yourself an expert, but I don't think I've ever honestly met a person so arrogant as to say that they're an
Yeah.
expert in love, you know.
Yeah.
Right,
Well,
right. And it's an active love too, right? It's a revolutionary love in an active way. Um, is a going out of yourself love,
Yes,
right? Taking
exactly
yourself
right.
out. And it's easy for me to love the people, like
What
you
is it?
guys and the people that think like me and all that. That's a piece of cake. The work comes in. Um, the action comes in when I have to do the
Yes.
work of
What is
seeing
it?
the other and being with them. Yeah.
What is it, Rob? Brother Cornell West says, justice is what love looks like on the outside.
Right. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like
I mentioned that the other day. Yeah.
right. It's got to be, it's a great spiritual migration. I mentioned earlier, I have 2 copies. I have the beaten up hardcover here and I have a nice crisp looking paperback. Both Rob and I did book studies of this, I think, in our parishes. I think you
Yeah.
did, Rob. I know
Yep.
we had
Last
done the
year,
one
yep.
over at the pub. Yeah. Um, what an incredible book. And one of the many things that you mentioned in here, picking up on this thread of love, right? Is how that manifests itself if we don't confront the injustices in our own structures and our own institutions. You're right. If more Christians today summon up the courage to take seriously the dark sides of history, we will wake up to the degree to which our religion still interprets the Bible exactly as our misguided ancestors did. No, we don't draw exactly the same conclusions, but we have neither acknowledged nor rejected the method of reading the Bible that has made those unacceptable interpretations acceptable. If we face our past, we will see how many power centers within Christian communities still carry white Christian supremacy and white Christian privilege cards in their back pockets, often without knowing they do so, and as a result can be found consistently allying themselves with oppressors rather than the oppressed. We will see behind a curtain, so to speak, exposing how many Christians still drink the old cocktails of God and gold, including the black gold of fossil fuels, of Christianity and white supremacy, of Christianity and privilege, of Christianity and colonialism, of Christianity and exceptionalism, of Christianity and violence. Look, we're just a few weeks, you just mentioned your previous president. We're just a few weeks removed from January 6th and the attempted insurrection of the Capitol. For us watching this as your neighbors, who'd we have on? Was it Lenny? Was it Lenny Duncan we had on the other day who asked, what's it like living next to a meth lab?
Yeah. So that was his question.
But, we watch this with horror, really, truly horror. I mean, this great nation, this pinnacle of democracy, and not just democracy, but, a nation that has shown great leadership throughout history in terms of moral leadership and so on. But to see images of Bible verses and flags that equate Jesus with Trump with Jesus, signs that say Jesus saves next to a noose waiting to hang the vice president. And we're learning more and more every day about the very roots of white supremacy behind so much of what happened that day, of all of those groups that were urged on by the president. Not so long ago, we had Robert P. Jones on here, whose book White Too Long speaks to this subject as well. And as I said, we just had Lenny Duncan on here, and his church to us whiteys in Dear Church, a plea to white Americans to get on with the work of doing white folks' work, which is dismantling white supremacy. I think we can all acknowledge these are difficult days. I also think that we're at the cusp of, as you say, a very revolutionary time in terms of what we might be able to do. Can you share your thoughts on where things are at in America right now? It's a deeply divided and painful time. And we hosted a series, the podcast did in the 4 weeks leading up to the election, called Canadians Praying for Americans. And we had Diana and we had Carol Day from out in Philly and a few others come on for a little brief thing in the middle. But we had 150 people from across Canada get together one night a week and pray because of what was going on in there between the pandemic and the election and all the sort of disunity. And there's a lot of crying now about being unified. Without any conversation about these terrible injustices. I just wonder if you can share how you're doing, how you're feeling, and how do you react to where you are in this moment?
Well, I feel like, boy, living next to a meth lab. I feel
you're
like
living in it.
I'm living upstairs from the meth lab, and it could blow up at any minute.
Right. Yeah.
I live down here in the South. I was involved in helping organize a big event for the Biden-Harris campaign last fall. And we had about 75 Proud Boys show up, interrupted our event, surrounded the event, blocked the entrance, heckled, harassed, cussed us out, all the rest. So when January 6th happened, I wasn't surprised.
You've seen it.
A lot of us have seen it coming for a long time. We have so much to work through on this side of the border. Obviously, our history is, you have similar history, but ours is, so much worse of our history of slavery, land theft from the native peoples, and all the rest. But in addition, we have this weird obsession with freedom of speech, which has fueled this whole radio talk show, right-wing media, thing that's been going on for decades. And what that does is it and add, Fox News and these sort of things, and it just puts people in a fever pitch of anxiety and hostility at all times. Yeah. And I really think it's almost like a mental illness. It's like people who are just so amped up by this all the time. Some folks might be interested. I wrote a short ebook. It's on my website. It's called The Second Pandemic: Authoritarianism in Your Future. And so I think as we're all focusing on COVID, there's this other pandemic that's spreading. Right. And so I think that's all ongoing, and we're at a very delicate period because the folks who are activated as authoritarian followers, something like 35% of our population, they, many of them could be reactivated at a moment's notice to pick up guns and show up for anything. And so we've got our work cut out for us. And what's super tragic is that white Christians, especially conservative Protestants, evangelicals, charismatics, Pentecostals, and white Roman Catholics, conservative white Roman Catholics, have been at the core of all this. And in some ways, I hate to say this, but I believe it's true, their Christianity in some ways groomed them to be authoritarian followers. And so there's long-term work to do to help the Christian faith stop being an accessory to these crimes.
Right. One of the grim milestones, of course, that we heard about this past week was the U.S. reaching 500,000 deaths due to COVID. And it's been a devastating year, and certainly the United States has been hit incredibly hard. With the change of the administration, though, came a change in tone, and that was certainly recognizable. It's probably fair to say that President Biden is living his faith in a very public way. That is certainly forefront. You retweeted Ryan Berghoff this week and offered amen to a sentiment of his I wanted to read that I thought was really good. He tweeted that the president's words marking the 500,000 lost lives were rooted in compassion and in empathy. The observance at the White House with candles and trumpets was quite moving. It feels so good to have an administration that understands human dignity and exemplifies it. How are you experiencing kind of that change of tone, as it were, in the White House? And can you speak maybe a little bit about how people of faith and the left have played a role in this last election that you went through?
Yeah. So, well, first, I guess maybe I can answer both together by just giving a kind of personal testimony in this. So Joe Biden was not my first choice. I don't think he was my second or third choice, but he has performed so far above my expectations. And I think his choice of Kamala Harris was brilliant. And I think the two of them as a team have just, I just don't know. There is no way to do this work at this time without having millions of people hate you. Right. But they've done about as good as could possibly be done, I think. So on that side, I'm really hopeful. Something else that happened this week is a group of evangelicals in the U.S. Came together to repudiate white Christian nationalism. And Red Letter Christians, Vote Common Good, a few other organizations pulled these folks together. That's a really positive sign.
That's big, yeah.
But I'll tell you, the number of white evangelicals that actually believe in white Christian nationalism is shocking. And then, and even more depressing is the number who don't agree with it, but who are afraid to say anything.
Right.
And so if Canadians want to pray for us on this side of the border, they could pray for some courage and backbone, and especially among white clergy, to make a stand and say this is wrong. And again, there's theological dimensions to this, because there are a whole lot of white supremacists that would never admit they're white supremacists, but they would proudly admit they're Christian supremacists.
Right.
And so I think their Christian supremacy, and they think in order to be a good Christian, you're supposed to be a supremacist.
Right.
And I think what happens is they don't realize that their Christian supremacy is their euphemism for white supremacy.
It's fueling it in a way. I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I mean, I think, and we're experiencing the same things here. I mean, don't get mistaken, but the degrees are different. And I think that one of the things that troubles us on this side of the border is so much of what happens in America eventually drifts. Excuse the expression, but sometimes shit splatters. And and so it's so I listen to some of the rhetoric politically on the right in this country now, and it's starting to reflect and frighten me. It's the same sort of stuff, because they see that this sort of divisive stuff works in terms of gaining power.
Yes.
And I just, as I hear you say about, this sort of Christian supremacy and white supremacy, and the fear that some of the white pastors particularly might have about coming out and saying, look, we got to stop this. I think about all of the senators and Congress people too, for that matter. I mean, I hadn't thought of that before, but I guess the same thing is happening in leadership in the church as is happening in the Republican Party right now. There's a group of people who are terrified to speak up and say what they really think for the fear of what Trump and the 35% of Americans who follow him will do.
There's a word that perfectly fits the behavior of a lot of these congressmen. It's a word that people don't use often, but it's the word craven.
Yes.
But there's a certain sense, I'm not surprised when politicians are craven, because part of their job description is to represent people. And they have to balance, to what degree do I try to offer moral leadership, and to what degree do I just try to represent the opinions of my people. But pastors are not supposed to be craven.
No, not supposed to have. We should have the courage, you know.
Exactly.
And moving to come above the just a Christian supremacy. One of the books of yours that I really loved, and some of the studying that I did a few years back in Chicago, was rooted in interfaith work. And so your book, Why Did Jesus, Moses, Buddha, and Muhammad Cross the Road? Christian Identity in a Multi-Faith World, was another great book study in his church, as we loved it. You tweeted on that same day of the 500,000 milestone, your gratitude for the pastors, priests, rabbis, imams, and other spiritual leaders who've walked with the sick, the dying, the survivors, the healthcare workers and their families, and reminding them of what a blessing each one of them are, and offering your honor and respect. In that book, Jesus, Moses, and Buddha, as I call it, I shorten the titles, but you write, if we speak of an angry God at all, we will speak of a God angry at indifference, angry at apathy, angry at racism and violence, angry at inhumanity, angry at waste, angry at destruction, angry at injustice, angry at hostile religious clannishness. That anger is never against us or them. It's against what is against us and them. I think, Brian, if there is an angry God, it's a God who's outraged with the negligence and the ignorance and the defiance and the unnecessary death this past year, and the sort of things that you just talked about in terms of also with the political environment and the unwillingness and the cravenness of political leaders and religious leaders to not grow a spine and speak up for what Jesus has modeled, let alone. And then in the context of our wider reality, our pluralistic culture, the other exemplars of faith that have borne witness to what peace and justice look like. Can you say a word or two about the faithfulness you've witnessed across faiths at this time of tragedy? Because I think that the voice that gets heard is that sort of loud, angry, sort of Christian nationalism. But the truth is, I mean, I believe that Biden and Harris got elected in a large part because of people on the progressive end of Christianity and other faiths who worked hard to see to it that that voice would not win. And I just wonder if you can say a few things about how important it is that people of faith, regardless of what faith, are actually doing the work of tending to the people who are hurting most right now.
So, well, first, let me say about the election. You are so right. I worked hard over these last couple of years with an organization called Vote Common Good, and our goal, we set a goal to try to shift 5 to 7% of white evangelical and Catholic voters in 5 swing states toward to stop supporting the current regime, and we largely succeeded in that, and that really was enough, obviously, along with the efforts of many others, to help there be a change. But in this last year during COVID, I'll just tell you 2 stories that come to mind right away. I have a dear friend who's a rabbi in California. And, you know, Jews, in many ways, they have rituals of mourning that I think are in some ways way more healthy than a lot of our Christian rituals, because what we tend to do is try to rush over the pain and rush over the grief and rush over the loss and get to the hope. Well, I'm all for hope, but I don't even think it's good psychology for people in any way to minimize their grief. And so there are traditions and rituals in Judaism of mourning. And so this rabbi friend of mine, I was talking to her, I guess on a Zoom call some months ago, and she said, this has been the hardest thing. She's had quite a few people die during COVID, and not being able to bring people together to mourn and grieve, she said, it's just meant that she needs to go and be present with people as an individual to help them. And, you know, when you love people and you grieve with them, it's not just something you turn off and walk out, you know, it accumulates. And I could feel in her voice the accumulated grief of so many families. And then just this week, one of my dearest friends, 70 years old, and he hadn't been able to get his vaccination. He was in the waiting list for vaccination. And about a week and a half ago, or about a couple of weeks ago, he got COVID. And last week, suddenly he got worse, and he was in the hospital. And we're still, you know, we're praying. It's been very touch and go. But his pastor, I talked to his pastor, and I could tell how, you know, so many pastors, and I'm sure you guys are experiencing this, to be close to people when you're one of the few people who can, you know, who now is brought into that inner circle to see the suffering and the loneliness and the fear. And this has been a tough year to add all that grief on top of having to convert services to online and
do all that.
What a year it's been. And, you know, people like you deserve a really good vacation as soon as possible.
I feel a tall beer in my future, Brian.
Yes.
Well, when the borders open again, we're thinking about going golfing in Florida. So maybe we'll have to. That'd be great. Boy, I wish we could just keep going on and on, Brian, but we're coming to the end of our time. One of the things we've been doing on our podcast over the month of February, because it's Black History Month, is inviting our guests to share any reflections or names or people that kind of come to mind during Black History Month that maybe were influential or that you think about. Any jump to mind?
Well, I'm so glad you're asking people that. I'd like to offer 2. One is just if I were to pick one African American in U.S. history who's been so important to me, it would be Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman to me represents the best of what Christianity is and can be. If people aren't familiar with his life story, he wrote a very famous book called Jesus and the Disinherited that Martin Luther King Jr. carried with him wherever he went. But Howard Thurman also was a leader in interfaith work. He traveled to India, met with Gandhi, just a brilliant and wonderful writer and a deep contemplative spirit as well. But there's somebody else I'd like to mention who is actually unnamed, and it's actually a group of people. My paternal grandfather was a white supremacist. He was very nice to everybody, but his deep belief was that white people were superior. And he had Bible verses for this. He quoted a Bible verse about the curse of Ham, and it was all that's worse about fundamentalism.
Yeah.
And one day when my dad was probably in his 80s before he died, he and I were taking a walk, and I said to him, you know, Dad, you always were such a leader in respecting, you know, people, whatever their race. And I said, you're so different than your father. I said, what made you different? And I wondered if it would be church and God and Christianity. He said it was the army. He said when he went in the army was integrated, you know, more deeply in World War II, and my dad was in the Korean War. And he said, when I worked side by side with African-American people, everything I'd been told was so obviously not true. And I just think of all of those people whose life and example influenced my father so that he can influence me. How grateful I am for that.
Yeah,
That's
thanks
fantastic.
be to God for
Good.
that.
No, thank you for that. That's excellent. Hey, our time's coming to an end again, folks. That's the new book.
Yeah, and
There
there's
it is.
there's a ton of old ones. And look,
And
this
there's
is
some
another
old
one of my
ones,
Everything Must Change. One of my favorites.
You know what? Look at that, Kevin. I got to tell Brian this because I was given this book in 2008 on the night after my ordination.
Who gave you that?
And the guy that gave me that is in that box right there. And he wrote, on this very special day, we wish you every blessing for a long and productive ministry. You are a great witness and you will be a wonderful priest. God bless you. And this was my introduction to Brian on my ordination.
That's great.
So I am absolutely thrilled that we are together today. It means so much to me personally. But Brian, your work certainly has been influential in my ministry. I know Kevin's, and we are so thankful that you could just give us a few minutes today. Thank you so much.
What a joy. What a joy. Thanks. And keep up the great work you're doing.
And, you know, I was not kidding about going to Florida to play golf. So,
amen.
you know, we got to check in with Brian when we're down there. But what a
Are you
thrill,
going to teach me how to play
Wasn't that
golf?
great? Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Sweet.
We will teach you on the fly, my friend.
I'm a lefty, by the way,
So
so
am
It's
I.
okay.
So
Oh,
it's
sweet.
okay.
Then
I
I'll
can
just
show
use
you.
Kevin's
Doesn't matter if
clubs.
you use my clubs.
Sweet.
Yep.
I
Don't
gotta
worry
say,
about that.
I am super stoked at that conversation. Totally chuffed that we got to talk to Brian McLaren. What
Yeah.
an incredibly nice man.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That was wonderful.
And I had, you know, until you mentioned it, I've forgotten I gave you that book at your ordination. But
I pulled out, I was looking through my Brian McLaren books, and I
Yeah.
remember you doing that and writing that
Yeah.
in there for me. And 13
First-
years ago, brother.
First book of his I read, what got me onto Brian McLaren, is called A Generous Orthodoxy. And
Right. Yeah.
for those of you out there listening, if you've never read a Brian McLaren book and you want to start somewhere, that's as good a place as any.
Yeah.
Because it really does begin to break open a conversation he had very publicly with his writing from then on about how how we can live a different way at this. And what a week, guys. Alan Roxburgh
It's been great. Yeah.
and Brian McLaren. I feel reinvigorated to work in the church.
All right, good. So let's get at it then. And we want to again thank our sponsors for making this all possible, because without them, we wouldn't be here. To A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated. To Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, and locally loved. And to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Gentlemen, that'll wrap up another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast. So you be good, you be safe,
You be good.
and remember Kevin, and I got to remind you every time, and you're not getting it, look both ways
Before you cross the street.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Iain, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!